He didn't bark. Not once. The dog moved like a shadow breaking loose from the pavement, a sudden blur of sable and breath in the dim amber glow of a London street lamp. And in that single silent motion, everything shifted. The evening had settled into that quiet hour just after 6, when the city exhales, shops closing their shutters, buses sighing at stops, the faint smell of rain clinging to the air like an unfinished thought. A soft drizzle had begun to fall, not enough to send people running, just enough to blur the edges of light and turn the pavement slick beneath careful footsteps. On the corner of a narrow high street, where a bakery's last warmth leaked through its glass and the hum of distant traffic softened into a low murmur, a small figure stood alone. Emily Carter, 8 years old, coat buttoned too high at the collar, fingers curled around the white cane she held like a compass in a world she could not see. She tilted her head slightly, listening, not with fear, but with the quiet concentration of someone who had learned to read the world through rhythm and echo. The tap of her cane measured the curb. The whisper of tires passing told her how wide the road might be. Somewhere behind her, a bell chimed faintly as a shop door closed, and she smiled, just a little, as if the sound itself had greeted her by name. A few yards away, near a lamppost where the light flickered once before holding steady, lay a German shepherd. Rex. He looked at rest, body low, head resting on his paws, rain tracing thin lines along the dark ridge of his back. To most, he would have seemed like any other dog waiting for someone who had stepped inside a shop. But there was nothing idle about the stillness in him. His ears twitched at every shift in the air. His eyes, deep and amber, did not wander. They watched, not the people who passed, not the glow of the bakery window. They watched the space just behind the girl. A man approached from the far end of the pavement, his footsteps uneven, not quite in time with the rest of the city. He slowed as he drew closer, adjusting his coat with a small, deliberate movement, as though deciding something without words. To anyone else it might have looked ordinary, a stranger navigating the same narrow stretch of pavement. But Rex's gaze did not soften. It sharpened. The dog's chest rose once, slow and controlled, as if measuring the distance not in yards, but in seconds. Emily shifted her weight, unaware, turning her face slightly toward the sound of those approaching steps. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice low, almost gentle, the kind of tone people used when they wanted to be trusted. Emily's smile returned, polite and open. "I'm just waiting for the crossing," she replied, her voice light, steady. She tapped her cane once more against the curb, confirming what she already knew. The man stepped closer. Too close. Rex's body tensed, though he did not rise. Not yet. The rain grew a touch heavier, dotting the pavement with soft, scattered taps. A bus passed at the far end of the road, its headlights smearing into long streaks of white against the wet asphalt. For a moment, the world narrowed to the small space between the girl and the man. "Let me help you," he offered, extending a hand she could not see. Emily hesitated, just briefly, not out of fear, but because something in the air had shifted, so slight it might have been missed by anyone who relied on sight alone. Rex rose, not abruptly, not with noise, just a smooth, deliberate lift from stillness into motion, his paws silent against the slick ground. His eyes did not leave the man's arm, not his face, not his voice, his arm, the fabric of the sleeve, the way it moved differently from the rest of him, a detail so small it hid in plain sight. The man took another step forward. Emily lifted her hand slightly, unsure. And in that breath, between offer and acceptance, Rex moved. No warning, no growl, just a sudden, precise surge of muscle and instinct, closing the distance in a heartbeat. The world seemed to pause around it. A woman across the street turned her head too late. A cyclist slowed, confusion flickering across his face. The soft rhythm of rain continued, indifferent. Rex placed himself between them, his body a barrier drawn without permission, his presence firm but controlled, as if he had stepped into a line no one else could see. Emily startled, her hand hovering in the air. "It's all right," the man said quickly, a note of strain threading through the calm. But Rex did not move back. He stood there, silent, unyielding, his breath steady, his eyes fixed with a certainty that did not need explanation. For a moment, no one understood. Not the girl, not the man, not the passers-by who began to slow, drawn by the sudden stillness that had replaced the ordinary flow of the street. It looked like interruption, like confusion, like a dog that had overstepped. But Rex did not waver. Because some dangers do not announce themselves. They do not shout. They do not run. They arrive quietly, dressed in kindness, carried in a voice that sounds safe. And sometimes, the only one who sees them is the one who does not need eyes at all. The air changed before anyone spoke, a subtle tightening that pressed against the skin like the moment before a storm chooses its direction. And for those watching it unfold, confusion came first, not understanding, not yet. Just that uneasy pause where instinct begins to whisper, but the mind has not caught up. And Emily felt it in the way the space around her seemed to hold its breath. The man's voice no longer quite as smooth. The dog's presence now a wall she could feel without seeing, warm, and steady and unmoving. And she lowered her hand slowly, uncertain, her fingers brushing against the coarse edge of Rex's fur, a contact that grounded her more than any explanation could have. While across the pavement a woman drew closer, her shoes clicking softly against the wet stone. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her tone cautious, not accusing. "Not yet," and the man shifted his weight, a small movement that did not escape Rex's eyes. "Just helping her cross," he replied, too. Quickly, as though the words had been prepared in advance, and Rex did not growl, did not bare his teeth. He simply remained exactly where he was, his body angled with quiet precision, his gaze still locked not on the man's face, but on the sleeve of his coat, watching that one detail as if the entire truth of the moment lived there. And the rain continued its gentle fall, tapping softly against umbrellas now opening in cautious curiosity, a cyclist slowing to a near stop, a shopkeeper leaning slightly out of a doorway, drawn by something he could not yet name, and Emily swallowed, her voice small but steady. "He does not usually do this," she said, her hand resting lightly on Rex's back, feeling the tension in him, the way his muscles held like coiled rope beneath his fur, ready but restrained. And for a second the man hesitated, just a flicker, barely there, but enough for the silence to deepen, enough for the woman beside them to notice the way his arm remained slightly angled away from his body, unnatural in its stillness, as if protecting something rather than simply existing. And then the faint wail of a siren drifted through the evening, distant at first, then clearer, threading its way through the narrow streets of the city like a quiet promise of order returning. And Rex's ears flicked once, acknowledging the sound without losing focus, and somewhere behind the gathering circle of onlookers, a figure moved with purpose, boots steady against the slick pavement, cutting through the hesitation of the crowd with the kind of calm that does not ask permission. Oliver Hayes had not intended to return so soon. The errand had been simple, a matter of minutes, but something had pulled him back, a sense he had learned long ago to trust. The kind that does not explain itself until it is already too late to ignore. And now he saw them, the shape of Rex, standing firm, the small figure of Emily beside him, the stranger too close, and everything in him sharpened at once. Not panic, not fear, just clarity. He did not run, he did not shout. He closed the distance with measured steps, each one deliberate, his eyes taking in the details the way they had been trained to do, the tension in Rex's stance, the angle of the man's shoulders, the way the crowd held itself at the edge of involvement. And when he reached them, he spoke only one word, quiet, but unmistakable, "Rex," and the dog's ears shifted slightly at the sound, not breaking position, not stepping back, just acknowledging, and Oliver stopped just short of the invisible line Rex had drawn, his gaze moving. To the man, calm but unyielding, "Step back," he said, not loud, not aggressive, simply certain, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow again, the rain softening into a hush, the city holding itself in that fragile balance between misunderstanding and truth, and the man forced a smile, thin now, strained at the edges. "I was only helping," he repeated, but the words no longer carried the same weight, no longer settled easily into the air, and Oliver's eyes did not leave him. "Then you will not mind giving her some space," he replied, his voice steady as stone, and the woman beside them shifted her stance, subtly aligning herself with Oliver without quite realizing it, and the cyclist dismounted fully, standing still now, watching, waiting, and Emily felt the change again, the quiet shift of balance, the way Rex's breathing eased just slightly, not relaxed, not yet, but less coiled, and she whispered, almost to herself. He knew, her fingers pressing a little more firmly into the thick fur beneath her hand, and Oliver heard it. Though he did not respond, his attention still fixed on the man's arm, the sleeve that had not moved quite right from the beginning, the detail that Rex had seen before any of them. And the siren grew louder now, closer, echoing faintly against the buildings, and in that sound there was something else, not resolution, not yet, but the promise of it, the sense that whatever truth lay hidden in this quiet, rain-soaked moment was about to be drawn into the light, not with force, not with noise, but with the same steady inevitability that had guided Rex to step forward when no one else had. And still, through it all, the siren did not rush the moment. It only underlined it, drawing a thin line of sound through the damp evening air as the small circle of strangers held their places like figures caught inside a painting that had not yet decided its ending. And Oliver did not move closer. He did not reach for Rex. He simply stood with that quiet certainty that belonged to men who had learned long ago that timing mattered more than force. And the man in front of him shifted again, just slightly, but this time it was enough for the woman beside them to take a half step back, enough for the cyclist to glance at Oliver with a question forming in his eyes, and enough for Rex's gaze to sharpen into something almost stiller than before, if such a thing were possible, because the dog was no longer reacting. He was waiting, and there is a difference between the two that most people never learn to see. Emily felt it in the way Rex's breathing slowed beneath her hand, steady and grounded, not tense with fear, but anchored in purpose. And she drew a quiet breath of her own, trusting something she could not explain, while the man forced another smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "This is unnecessary," he said, his voice thinner now, stretched by the attention gathering around him. "I was only offering help." And Oliver nodded once, as though he had heard those words many times before in many different places. "Then you will have no trouble stepping away," he replied, calm, unwavering, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with the weight of what had not yet been revealed, the rain softening into a fine mist that clung to coats and hair, blurring the edges of everything except the center of this quiet standstill. And then the police car turned the corner, its lights reflecting in long streaks across the wet pavement, not flashing urgently, not with alarm, but present, steady. A quiet authority that settled into the space without disturbing it. Two officers stepped out, their movements measured, their expressions attentive but not alarmed, and one of them approached, his voice even. "Evening. What seems to be the issue here?" And for a moment no one answered, because no one quite knew how to explain what had happened. Not yet, not without sounding uncertain. And then Oliver spoke, not with accusation, not with urgency, simply with clarity. "My dog stopped him from getting too close to the girl," he said, his hand resting lightly at his side, not pointing, not demanding, just stating what was. And the officer nodded slowly, his gaze moving from Oliver to Rex, then to the man, taking in the positions, the distance, the tension that still lingered in the air like a question, waiting to be answered. "Sir, would you mind stepping over here for a moment?" he said, gesturing gently, and the man hesitated again, a fraction longer this time, long enough for something unspoken to pass between the two officers, and Rex's ears flicked once more, his body still forming that invisible barrier, not aggressive, not advancing, simply present, and Emily tightened her grip slightly on his fur, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is all right," she murmured, though it was not clear whether she was speaking to herself or to the dog, and Oliver heard it, the quiet trust in her tone, and something in his expression softened, just for a second, before returning to focus. The officer waited, patient, not pressing, allowing the moment to unfold on its own terms, and finally the man stepped back, one careful step, then another, as though retreating from something he could not quite name. And in that movement the balance shifted again, subtle but undeniable, the space around Emily widening, the air easing, and Rex did not follow. He did not advance. He simply held his ground until the distance was enough, until the line he had drawn was no longer being tested, and only then did his posture change, not fully relaxed, but less rigid, his weight settling evenly across his paws, his breathing returning to a slow, steady rhythm, and the officer glanced at his colleague, then back at the man, his attention now drawn to the small details, the way the coat sleeve hung, slightly uneven, the way the fabric did not fall naturally, and he stepped closer, polite but firm. "Sir, would you mind if I take a quick look at your arm there?" he asked, not accusing, not assuming, just asking, and the man's expression flickered, just for a heartbeat, and in that flicker the truth began to surface, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like something long hidden finally finding its way into the light. And Emily felt Rex shift beneath her hand, not in tension, but in release, a slow exhale that seemed to carry the weight of the moment away. And she leaned slightly toward him, her voice soft, certain now. "You knew," she whispered, and Rex did not respond with sound, but his presence spoke enough, and Oliver, watching it all unfold, lowered his gaze for a brief second, a gesture of acknowledgement, of understanding, before looking back up at the officers, because sometimes the difference between danger and safety is not what is seen, but who is willing to stand still long enough to recognize it. The officer did not rush his hand. He did not reach with suspicion, only with a quiet professionalism that seemed to slow the world even further, and as his fingers hovered near the sleeve, the man shifted again, a small recoil masked as discomfort, but it was enough for the second officer to step closer, not threatening, just present, closing the space in a way that left little room for retreat without making it feel like a trap, and the street, which moments ago had been filled with the soft rhythm of evening, now held a different kind of stillness, the kind that listens, that waits, that senses something just beneath the surface about to reveal itself. And Emily stood very still, her hand resting on Rex, her fingers tracing the damp line of his fur as if reading a story written in warmth and breath. And she did not ask questions, she did not need to, because the answer was already there in the way Rex had chosen to stand, in the way Oliver had not doubted him, and in the way the air itself seemed to shift around them. And the officer spoke again, his tone unchanged. "It will only take a moment," he said, and this time the man did not answer immediately, his gaze flicking once toward the small crowd that had gathered, then back to the officer. And in that hesitation the truth deepened, not in words, but in the absence of them, and slowly, with a movement that tried to appear casual but carried a weight it could not hide, he adjusted his arm, and the fabric of the sleeve pulled just slightly tighter than it should have, revealing a stiffness that did not belong to ordinary clothing. And the officer noticed, of course he did, but he did not react sharply. He simply reached forward and gently took hold of the cuff, lifting it just enough to see what had been concealed within its folds, and for a brief second, the world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact, the place where unseen intention met quiet discovery. And then the officer exhaled, not in alarm, not in shock, but in confirmation, a soft release of breath that carried understanding with it. And he glanced at his colleague, a silent exchange passing between them before either spoke, and the second officer nodded once, stepping slightly to the side as if to guide the man away without the need for force, and the crowd, sensing the shift, fell even quieter, the earlier confusion now giving way to something else, something closer to recognition, as if a story they had not yet known they were part of had suddenly revealed its meaning. And Emily felt it too, the way the tension dissolved not with noise but with absence, like a held breath finally released, and she leaned closer to Rex, her voice soft, almost a whisper carried by the rain. "It is all right now," she said, and Rex's ears lowered slightly, not in submission, but in a quiet easing, his body no longer a barrier, just a presence, steady and calm. And Oliver stepped forward then, not urgently, just enough to close the distance between them, his hand reaching down to rest briefly against Rex's neck, a gesture of connection, of trust, of something deeper than command. And he did not praise him with loud words, did not draw attention to what had been done. He simply let his hand remain there for a moment, grounding, acknowledging, and the officer returned his attention to Oliver. "Your dog has a keen sense," he said, his voice measured, respectful, and Oliver gave a small nod, his gaze still on Rex. "He listens to things most of us ignore," he replied, and there was no pride in his tone, only a quiet truth, the kind that does not need to be explained to be understood, and the rain began to ease, the fine mist lifting just enough for the streetlights to shine clearer against the damp pavement, casting reflections that stretched like soft ribbons of gold beneath their feet, and the crowd slowly began to disperse, not with chatter or excitement, but with a subdued calm, each person carrying away a piece of what they had witnessed without quite knowing how to name it. And the cyclist mounted his bike again, glancing back once before riding off. The shopkeeper retreated into his doorway. The woman who had first stepped forward offered Emily a gentle smile before continuing on her way, and the officers guided the man toward the car, not roughly, not with spectacle, just with quiet authority. And as they moved away, the space they left behind felt different, lighter somehow, as though something unseen had been removed from it, and Emily turned her face slightly toward Oliver, her expression open, trusting. "Is he yours?" she asked, her hand still resting on Rex, and Oliver crouched down to her level, his movements careful, respectful of her space. "He is," he said, his voice softer now, and she nodded, a small, certain motion. "He is good," she said, and Oliver allowed a faint smile to touch his lips, not broad, not fleeting, just enough to acknowledge what did not need to be said. And Rex stood quietly between them, no longer a shield, no longer a warning, just a dog once more, though the truth of what he had done lingered in the air like the last note of a song that refuses to fade. And as the evening resumed its gentle rhythm, there was a sense, subtle but undeniable, that something important had passed through that narrow street, something not loud or dramatic, but precise, timely, and deeply right, the kind of moment that does not ask to be remembered, yet stays with those who witnessed it, long after the rain has dried and the lights have dimmed. The street did not return to normal all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a held breath easing back into rhythm, the distant hum of traffic growing clearer again, footsteps resuming their quiet patterns, and the faint warmth from the bakery window spilling once more onto the damp pavement, as if nothing had changed, and yet something had, something subtle but lasting, carried in the way people glanced twice before moving on, in the way silence lingered just a second longer between sounds, and Emily remained where she stood, her hand still resting on Rex as though she had found a point in the world that did not shift, and Oliver stayed crouched beside her, not rushing her away, not filling the moment with unnecessary words, just allowing the calm to settle naturally, because he understood that some moments were not meant to be explained, only felt, and Rex stood between them, no longer rigid, his posture relaxed but attentive, the quiet vigilance still present in the way his ears moved at each passing sound, and Emily tilted her head slightly, listening again to the world around her. The rhythm of footsteps, the distant engine of a bus, the soft drip of water from a shop awning, and she smiled faintly. "It sounds different now," she said, her voice thoughtful, and Oliver followed her gaze though he knew she could not see it. "Sometimes it does," he replied, his tone gentle, and she nodded, as if that answer was enough, as if she understood something beyond the words themselves, and after a moment she turned her face toward him. "Will you stay until I cross?" she asked, simple, direct, and Oliver did not hesitate. "Of course," he said, rising slowly to his feet. And Rex shifted with him, aligning without command, a silent agreement between them that needed no instruction, and together they moved toward the curb, Emily's cane tapping lightly once more, finding the edge she had memorized through sound and distance, and Oliver stood just to her side, not guiding her hand, not taking control, only present, while Rex positioned himself slightly ahead, his body angled toward the road, watching, always watching, and the traffic light changed with its familiar click, the subtle shift in sound that Emily recognized immediately, and she stepped forward with quiet confidence, her pace measured, steady, and Oliver walked beside her, matching her rhythm without overtaking it, while Rex moved just ahead, scanning, his paws silent against the wet crossing, and the world seemed to hold itself again, not in tension this time, but in quiet respect, as if acknowledging the small procession moving through it. And when they reached the other side, Emily paused, turning slightly toward Oliver. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying a sincerity that did not need embellishment, and Oliver inclined his head. "You are welcome," he replied, and there was a brief silence then, not awkward, not uncertain, just a space where something unspoken settled between them, and Emily's hand drifted once more to Rex, her fingers brushing the side of his neck. "And thank you," she added softly, and Rex's tail gave a small, measured movement, not exuberant, not seeking attention, just an acknowledgement, and Oliver watched the exchange, his expression thoughtful, as though he was witnessing something that went beyond the moment itself, something that reached deeper, into the quiet bond between trust and instinct. And after a second, Emily spoke again. "He saw it before anyone else, did he not?" And Oliver exhaled slowly, considering. "He felt it," he said, and she smiled. A small, knowing curve of her lips. "That is better," she replied, and for a moment the world seemed very still again. But this time it was a peaceful stillness, the kind that follows resolution, that lingers like the last light of evening before night fully settles. And from across the street, the faint glow of a shop sign flickered on, casting a soft reflection across the pavement, and the drizzle had almost stopped now, leaving behind only the scent of rain in the air, clean and quiet. And Oliver straightened, his hand resting briefly on Rex once more. "Do you have someone waiting for you?" he asked, and Emily nodded. "My mother will be at the end of the road," she said, gesturing slightly with her cane. And Oliver glanced in that direction, the line of terraced houses, stretching into the dim light, and he gave a small nod. "Then we will walk you there," he said, not as a question, but as a simple continuation of what had already begun, and Emily accepted without hesitation, stepping forward again with that same steady rhythm, her cane marking each step, and Rex moved with her, his presence constant, his attention never fully relaxing, because some instincts do not switch off. They simply settle into a quieter form, and as they walked, the city resumed around them, the ordinary sounds of evening weaving back into place. Yet for those who had witnessed what had passed, there remained a quiet understanding that sometimes protection does not come with warning, that sometimes it arrives in silence, in a single movement made at the exact moment it is needed, and that trust, once placed, does not require sight to recognize what is true. And in that narrow London street, under the soft glow of returning light, three figures moved forward together, not as strangers anymore, but as something gently connected by a moment that would not ask to be remembered, yet would not easily be forgotten. The pavement grew quieter as they moved away from the crossing, not empty, but softened, as though the city itself was giving them space to continue in their own rhythm. And Emily walked with the same steady cadence, her cane tapping lightly ahead of her, each step measured, each sound interpreted with a quiet confidence that did not need sight to guide it. And Oliver stayed just half a step to her side, never leading, never correcting, only present, while Rex moved slightly ahead, his form cutting a calm path through the dim glow of street lamps, his attention never fully resting, always scanning, always listening, because even when danger had passed, the instinct to guard did not fade. It simply settled into the background like a quiet promise, and the air carried that familiar London scent of damp stone and distant exhaust, softened now by the fading drizzle, and somewhere a door closed gently, the sound echoing briefly before dissolving into the evening, and Emily tilted her head slightly. "It smells like rain is leaving," she said, her voice thoughtful, and Oliver glanced upward, where the clouds had begun to thin, revealing a faint hint of clearer sky beyond. "It is," he replied, and she smiled again, that same small, certain smile that seemed to come not from what she could see, but from what she understood, and they continued along the narrow row of terraced houses, each one lit softly from within, windows glowing with quiet life, the silhouettes of people moving behind curtains, unaware of the moment that had unfolded just streets away. And Rex slowed slightly as they approached a small iron gate at the end of the road, his ears lifting, his attention shifting not with alarm, but recognition, and Emily stopped just before it, her cane tapping once against the low step, confirming what she already sensed, and before she could speak, a voice called softly from beyond the gate, "Emily." And there was relief in it, gentle but unmistakable, and Emily's face brightened at once. "I am here, Mom," she answered, her voice lifting just enough to carry across the short distance. and a woman stepped forward into the soft glow of the porch light. Her coat pulled close against the lingering chill, her expression easing the moment she saw her daughter standing safely at the gate. And then her eyes moved to Oliver, and to Rex, and something unspoken passed through her gaze, a question, a concern, and then a quiet understanding that did not need to be fully explained, and Emily reached out slightly, her hand brushing the gate. "I met someone," she said simply, "and his dog." And the woman opened the gate quickly, stepping forward, her hand finding Emily's shoulder with a gentle firmness that spoke of both habit and care. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice low, and Emily nodded. "I am," she said, because he was there. And she turned her face slightly toward Rex, her hand extending once more to touch his fur, and the woman followed that gesture, her eyes softening as she took in the dog's calm presence, the quiet steadiness in his stance. And then she looked to Oliver. "Thank you," she said, the words simple, but carrying a weight that went beyond politeness. And Oliver inclined his head slightly. "He did most of it," he replied, his tone even, and the woman allowed a small, grateful smile. "Then thank him for me," she said, and Rex's tail moved once, a slow, measured motion, as if acknowledging the sentiment without needing to respond further, and for a moment they all stood there, the soft light from the porch wrapping around them, the city fading into a distant hum, and Emily spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost reflective. "He knew before anyone else," she said, not as a question, but as a truth she had already accepted, and Oliver looked at Rex, his hand resting briefly against the side of the dog's neck. "He listens in a different way," he said, and Emily nodded, as though that answered everything, and her mother glanced between them, sensing the depth of something she had not witnessed, yet feeling its presence all the same, and she drew Emily a little closer. "Come inside," she said gently, and Emily hesitated for just a second, her hand still on Rex, as though she was reluctant to let go of the connection that had guided her safely home. And then she leaned forward slightly, her voice soft. "Good night," she said, and Rex remained still, his gaze steady, his presence calm. And Oliver gave a quiet nod. "Good night, Emily," he said, and with that, she stepped through the gate, her mother guiding her inside, the door closing softly behind them, leaving the street once more in its quiet evening state. And Oliver remained there for a moment, not moving, his eyes resting on the closed door, as if acknowledging the end of something that had not needed a beginning. And then he exhaled slowly, turning his attention back to Rex, who stood beside him, calm, composed, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. And Oliver crouched slightly, his hand brushing through the damp fur along Rex's neck. "You saw it," he murmured, not as praise, not as surprise, just as recognition, and Rex's ears shifted slightly at the sound of his voice, his posture relaxing just a fraction more, and the street around them continued its gentle rhythm, the faint glow of streetlights reflecting off the drying pavement, the quiet hum of distant life carrying on as it always did. And after a moment, Oliver straightened, giving Rex a small, almost imperceptible signal, and together they turned to leave, their footsteps soft against the ground, moving back into the ordinary flow of the city, though the echo of what had passed lingered, not in noise or spectacle, but in the quiet understanding that sometimes the difference between harm and safety is not seen, not heard, but simply known, and acted upon without hesitation. The night settled gently over the street as Oliver and Rex walked away, their footsteps blending into the quiet rhythm of the city, and yet something lingered in the air, not tension, not fear, but a memory that had not fully faded, like the echo of a sound that continues long after it has been made. And Rex moved beside Oliver with that same steady presence, his pace unhurried, his gaze calm but never idle, and Oliver glanced down at him briefly, not to check, not to command, but simply to acknowledge, because there are moments when words are unnecessary, when understanding exists in the space between movement and stillness. And the pavement stretched ahead beneath the soft glow of streetlights, each one casting a pool of light that faded into the next, creating a quiet path through the evening. And the drizzle had stopped completely now, leaving behind a faint sheen that reflected the city like a muted mirror, and somewhere in the distance a train passed, its low rumble carrying through the ground, a reminder that life continued beyond this small pocket of stillness. And Oliver slowed slightly as they reached the corner, his eyes scanning the street ahead, not out of habit alone, but because some instincts do not switch off, they simply become part of who you are. And Rex paused beside him, his ears lifting just a fraction, responding to something unseen, something subtle, and Oliver noticed, of course he did, because he had learned to read those small shifts, the quiet signals that spoke louder than any command. And he followed Rex's gaze for a moment, but the street remained calm, empty save for a distant figure walking under a lamplight. And after a second Rex's posture eased, the tension fading as quietly as it had appeared, and Oliver exhaled softly, almost to himself, still listening. He murmured, and Rex's tail moved once, a slow, measured gesture that seemed less like a response and more like a confirmation. And they continued walking, the city unfolding around them in layers of sound and light, and Oliver's thoughts drifted, not to the event itself, but to the moment before it, to the way Rex had moved without hesitation, without doubt, guided by something that could not be trained, only trusted. And he had seen it before, in places far from this quiet London street, places where the air carried different scents, sharper, heavier, and where the cost of hesitation had been far greater, and he remembered the first time he had learned to trust that instinct, not fully understanding it then, only recognizing its outcome, the quiet precision of it, the way it always came at the exact moment it was needed. And now, standing in the calm aftermath of something that could have been otherwise, he felt that same quiet certainty settle in his chest. Not relief, not pride, just recognition. And Rex walked on, unaware of the weight of what had passed, or perhaps simply unaffected by it, because for him it had not been extraordinary. It had been necessary, and necessity does not ask for acknowledgement. It simply exists. And as they turned onto a wider street, the sound of passing cars grew clearer, tires whispering against the damp road, headlights cutting through the soft darkness, and Oliver paused again, this time not because of Rex, but because of himself, because something in the moment asked for stillness. And he looked back once, down the road they had come from, toward the faint outline of the houses where Emmeline now stood safe inside. And for a second the city seemed to narrow into that single point of memory, and then it widened again, returning to its usual rhythm, and Oliver turned forward, his hand brushing lightly against Rex's back, a gesture that carried more meaning than any spoken word. And Rex leaned slightly into the touch before straightening again, his focus returning to the path ahead. And they moved on together, not as heroes, not as something set apart, but as part of the quiet fabric of the city, woven into its ordinary moments in a way that would never be fully seen, and yet would always be there, in the unseen spaces between what happens and what almost does. And as they disappeared further into the evening, the street behind them settled completely, the lights steady, the air calm, and the only trace of what had occurred remained in the subtle shift of something intangible, a reminder that sometimes protection does not arrive with noise or warning, but with a single, silent step taken at exactly the right time. And in that step, lives can change without ever realizing how close the night carried them forward, but it did not erase what had been set into motion, because some moments do not end when the scene changes. They continue quietly, unfolding in places unseen, and a few streets away, under the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the low murmur of a police station settling into its evening routine. The earlier stillness had followed, not as tension, but as something waiting to be understood, and the officers who had been present now moved with the same calm precision they had shown on the street, their voices low, their actions measured, not rushed, not dramatic, because what had been discovered did not require spectacle, only clarity. And the man sat quietly, his earlier composure replaced not with resistance, but with a kind of quiet absence, as though the certainty he had carried before had slipped away the moment it was seen, truly seen. And the sleeve that had drawn Rex's attention now lay still, its hidden detail no longer concealed, not dangerous in its presence alone, but in its intent, in the quiet purpose it had carried before being interrupted. And one officer leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, not in frustration, but in reflection. "It was the dog," he said, more to himself than anyone else, and his colleague gave a small nod. He saw what we did not. He replied, and for a moment neither spoke further, because there are times when explanation feels smaller than the truth itself. And outside, the city continued, unaware of the small shift that had taken place within its quiet streets, unaware of how close something had come to changing the shape of an ordinary evening. And back on those same streets, Oliver and Rex had already disappeared into the rhythm of it all, their presence no longer marked by attention, just another pair moving through the soft glow of lamplight. And Rex's pace had settled into something even, unhurried, his earlier focus now softened, though never gone. Because what had guided him was not something that switched on and off, it was something constant, a quiet awareness that lived beneath every step. And Oliver walked beside him, his hands relaxed at his sides, his shoulders no longer carrying the subtle tension of watchfulness. And yet his mind did not drift far, because he understood the weight of what had passed, not in fear, not in speculation, but in recognition, the kind that comes from having stood at the edge of moments before, moments where one decision, one movement, changes everything without announcing itself. And he thought of Emily, of the way she had stood there, unaware of what had approached, and yet completely aware of what had protected her. And something about that stayed with him, not as concern, but as something quieter, something that settled deeper. And Rex slowed slightly as they reached a small park bordered by iron railings. The gates still open, though the space beyond lay mostly empty, the grass dark under the dim light, the paths glistening faintly where the rain had passed. And Oliver paused, glancing toward it, and without a word, Rex turned slightly, stepping inside as if guided by an unspoken agreement, and they moved along the path together, the city noise softening at the edges, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant call of something unseen in the trees. And Oliver stopped near a bench, lowering himself slowly, his elbows resting loosely on his knees, and Rex stood beside him for a moment before settling at his feet, his body folding into the quiet with ease. And for a while, neither moved, neither spoke, because silence, in moments like this, was not empty, it was full, carrying everything that had not needed to be said. And Oliver reached down, his hand resting on Rex's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, grounding, familiar. And he spoke softly, not as a command, not as praise, but as something closer to acknowledgement. "You do not hesitate," he murmured, and Rex's ear flicked slightly at the sound, his head lifting just enough to meet Oliver's gaze. And in that brief exchange there was no need for more, because understanding had already been given and accepted. And the park remained still around them, the faint light from the street casting long shadows through the railings, the air carrying that fresh, clean scent that follows rain. And somewhere beyond the trees, the city continued its endless motion, unaware, unchanged. And yet, for those who had stood in that narrow street, who had felt the shift from uncertainty to clarity, something had been altered, something that would not be spoken of loudly, would not be written or remembered in grand terms, but would exist quietly in the way they looked at the world after, in the way they paused just a fraction longer before trusting what they saw, and in the way they might, one day, recognize the value of what cannot be seen at all. And as Oliver sat there, his hand still resting against Rex, he did not think of what might have happened. He did not dwell on the edge that had been avoided, because that was not where truth lived. Truth lived in what had been done, in the simple, silent act of stepping forward at exactly the right moment. And in that, there was nothing to add, nothing to question, only the quiet understanding that sometimes the most important things are not those we witness, but those we never have to. The park did not demand attention. It simply held it, a quiet pocket of stillness set apart from the city's restless pulse. And Oliver remained seated on the cold wooden bench, his posture relaxed but not idle, his gaze resting somewhere beyond the iron railings where the faint glow of passing headlights traced slow arcs along the wet road. And Rex lay at his feet, his body settled yet alert in that subtle way that never fully disappeared, as though even rest for him carried purpose. And the air had grown clearer now, the last traces of rain lifting into a cool, clean scent that lingered in the grass and along the narrow paths. And for a while, time seemed to stretch, not in length, but in depth. each second holding more than it normally would, because moments like this were not measured by clocks, but by the quiet understanding they left behind, and Oliver let his hand rest loosely against Rex's back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, grounding him in the present, anchoring him to something simple and certain, and he closed his eyes for just a second, not in fatigue, but in reflection, allowing the earlier events to pass through his mind without clinging to them, because he had learned long ago that holding on to such moments too tightly only distorted them, and instead he let them settle where they belonged, in that quiet space between memory and meaning. And when he opened his eyes again, the park looked unchanged, the same dim lights, the same empty paths, the same quiet trees standing like silent witnesses to nothing in particular, and yet it felt different, not because of anything visible, but because of what had been understood. And Rex shifted slightly, his head lifting just enough to glance up at Oliver, his eyes catching the faint light, and there was no question in them, no need for reassurance, only presence, steady and unwavering. And Oliver gave a small nod, as if answering something unspoken, and then his gaze drifted again, this time not to the street, but inward, to a place where memory and instinct met, and he thought of the countless times he had seen Rex respond before a command was given, before a signal was recognized, guided by something that existed beyond training, something that could not be fully explained, only trusted, and he had once tried to define it, to break it down into patterns and responses, to understand it in the way men are taught to understand things, through logic and repetition. But over time he had realized that some things resist explanation not because they are unclear, but because they are complete in themselves, and Rex was one of those things. His instincts not a mystery to be solved, but a truth to be accepted, and Oliver exhaled. Slowly, the breath leaving him in a quiet release, and he leaned back slightly, his shoulders easing as the last of the tension he had not noticed began to fade, and the city beyond the park carried on, its distant sounds weaving together into a soft, continuous hum, neither intrusive nor absent, just there, like the background of a life that does not pause for any one moment. And Rex lowered his head again, his body settling fully this time, though his ears still moved faintly at each distant sound, and Oliver watched him for a moment, the quiet strength in that simple presence, and he spoke softly, almost as if continuing a thought that had not been spoken aloud. You do not need to understand it, do you? And Rex did not respond with movement, but there was something in the stillness that answered all the same, and Oliver allowed a faint smile to touch his lips, not broad, not fleeting, just enough to acknowledge what did not need to be said, and after a while, he pushed himself to his feet, the bench creaking softly beneath the shift, and Rex rose immediately, not with urgency, but with readiness, his body aligning with Oliver's movement as naturally as breath follows thought, and together they moved toward the gate, the iron bars casting long, thin shadows across the path, and as they stepped back onto the pavement, the city greeted them once more, unchanged in its motion, indifferent to what had passed, and yet carrying it all the same, in the quiet spaces between its noise. And Oliver paused for just a second, his gaze lifting down the street, and he thought again of Emily, of the way she had trusted without seeing, of the way she had understood without needing proof. And something about that stayed with him, not as a question, but as an answer he had not realized he needed, and he turned to Rex, his hand brushing lightly along the dog's side. "Come on," he said, his voice steady, and Rex stepped forward beside him, their pace even, their presence unremarkable to those who passed, and they disappeared into the flow of the evening, leaving behind only the faint echo of something that had been prevented, something that had not needed to happen to be understood. And as the night deepened and the city lights burned a little brighter against the dark, there remained a quiet truth, carried not in words or actions, but in the simple, silent certainty that sometimes what protects us is not what we see coming, but what steps in before we ever have the chance to notice. The city did not remember them, not in the way people remember names or faces, but in the quieter way it holds moments within its rhythm, absorbed into the endless flow of footsteps and light. And Oliver walked on with Rex at his side, their pace steady, their presence unremarkable, just another man and his dog moving through the layered pulse of London at night. And yet for Oliver, the evening had not closed. It had simply shifted into something more reflective, something that lingered beneath the surface of ordinary thought. And as they moved along the pavement, past rows of dim shop fronts and the occasional glow of late-open cafes, he found himself noticing details he might otherwise have overlooked. The way a lamppost hummed faintly with electricity, the way rainwater gathered in shallow dips along the curb, the quiet rhythm of a distant crossing signal clicking in intervals like a measured heartbeat. And Rex moved through it all with the same calm awareness, his head level, his gait smooth, his presence grounded in a way that did not seek attention yet commanded it all the same. And Oliver slowed slightly as they approached a small junction, the traffic light ahead casting a soft red glow across the wet road, and he stopped at the curb without thinking, the habit automatic, the pause instinctive, and Rex stopped with him, aligning just half a step forward, his ears flicking once toward the faint sound of an approaching engine. And for a moment they stood there in stillness, not waiting with impatience, not watching with urgency, simply present within the space between movement and pause. And Oliver glanced down at Rex, his expression thoughtful, as if weighing something unspoken, and he let out a slow breath. "You felt it before it became anything," he murmured, his voice low, almost lost beneath the soft hum of the city. And Rex did not respond with movement, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be seen to be understood. And the light changed with a soft click, the red giving way to green, and Oliver stepped forward, crossing at an even pace, Rex moving alongside him with the same quiet precision. And as they reached the other side, the rhythm of walking resumed, steady, unbroken, yet carrying with it something deeper than before. And Oliver's thoughts drifted again, not to the danger that had been avoided, but to the moment of decision, that single instant when Rex had moved without hesitation, without waiting for confirmation, guided by something that existed beyond command or instruction. And he had seen men hesitate in moments far less uncertain, had seen doubt take hold where clarity was needed. And yet here, in the quiet of an ordinary street, a dog had acted with a certainty that required no explanation. And Oliver found himself considering that, not as a comparison, but as a quiet truth, that sometimes the purest form of understanding is not taught, but carried, embedded in instinct, refined through trust. And he glanced down again, his hand brushing lightly against Rex's shoulder as they walked, a simple contact that spoke more than any praise could. And Rex leaned slightly into it before continuing forward, his attention already shifting to the path ahead. And the city opened up around them as they moved into a broader avenue, the buildings taller, the lights brighter, reflections stretching across the damp pavement like elongated shadows of gold and white. And people passed by in small clusters, their conversations low, their movements unhurried, unaware of the quiet weight carried within the simple act of walking beside them. And Oliver continued on, his pace unchanged, his posture relaxed. Yet within him there was a subtle shift, not visible, not spoken, but present, a deeper recognition of something he had always known, but perhaps never fully acknowledged, that protection does not always come from strength alone, nor from training or preparation, but from a willingness to act when action is needed, without waiting for certainty to catch up. And Rex embodied that in a way that could not be measured or explained, only witnessed and accepted. And as they reached the far end of the avenue, where the street narrowed again into quieter residential rows, Oliver slowed once more, his gaze drifting briefly to the sky above, where the clouds had parted just enough to reveal a faint scattering of stars, dim against the city's glow but present all the same. And he stood there for a moment, not searching, not thinking, simply allowing the stillness to settle. And Rex paused beside him, his body calm, his presence steady. And in that shared silence, there was no need to revisit what had happened, no need to define it or give it shape, because its meaning had already settled where it belonged, in the quiet understanding that sometimes the most important moments are those that pass without recognition, those that leave no mark except the absence of what might have been. And Oliver lowered his gaze again, his hand resting briefly on Rex's back. "We keep moving," he said softly, not as a command, but as a reflection of what always came next. And Rex stepped forward at once, their path continuing into the dimly lit street ahead, the city closing gently around them, carrying their footsteps into its endless rhythm, where moments begin and end without notice, and yet some remain, not in memory alone, but in the way they shape the quiet decisions that follow. Long after the night has the street narrowed further as they moved on, the city gradually softening into quieter rows of houses where lights spilled gently from curtained windows, and the rhythm of passing traffic faded into something more distant, more subdued, and Oliver slowed his pace without fully realizing it, not from fatigue, but from the way the evening had settled into him, the way it had shifted something subtle, yet lasting beneath the surface of his thoughts. And Rex remained at his side, his presence constant, his steps measured with that same quiet assurance that had guided him earlier, though now there was no urgency in it. Only a steady awareness that seemed to belong as much to the night as to the dog himself, and the pavement stretched ahead in a long, uninterrupted line, damp but no longer glistening, the last traces of rain absorbed into the stone, leaving behind only a faint coolness in the air, and Oliver's gaze drifted once more, not searching, not scanning, simply taking in the quiet details that defined this part of the city, the low hum of a distant boiler, the soft rustle of leaves caught in a narrow alley, the occasional flicker of a television screen casting brief shadows against a wall, and there was a calm in it, a kind of ordinary peace that existed alongside the memory of what had passed, not erasing it, but placing it in context, as one moment among many. And yet Oliver knew it had not been just another moment, not in the way it had unfolded, not in the way it had been met. And he glanced down at Rex again, his expression thoughtful, his hand lowering briefly to brush against the dog's shoulder, a simple contact that carried more meaning than words could easily hold. And Rex leaned into it for the briefest of seconds before continuing forward, his attention already returning to the path ahead, and Oliver allowed a faint breath to escape him. Not quite a sigh, not quite relief, just a quiet release of something that had been held without notice. And they continued on, their footsteps soft against the pavement, blending into the gentle rhythm of the street. And as they passed beneath another lamppost, its light casting a warm circle around them, Oliver paused again, this time deliberately, his eyes lifting toward the row of houses on either side, each one carrying its own quiet story behind closed doors. And he thought again of Emily, of the way she had stood without sight, yet with certainty, trusting what she could feel rather than what she could see. And something about that stayed with him, not as a question, but as a quiet affirmation, that understanding does not always come through the senses we rely on most, and sometimes, those who see less perceive more. And Rex shifted slightly beside him, his ears lifting for a moment as a faint sound carried from further down the street, a door opening, a voice calling softly, nothing unusual, nothing urgent, and yet he noted it all the same. And Oliver noticed the shift in turn, not reacting, not questioning, simply acknowledging, because that was the nature of their connection, not one of constant command, but of shared awareness. And after a moment, Rex's posture eased again, the sound passing without significance, and Oliver nodded faintly, as if confirming what had already been understood, and they moved on once more, the night unfolding quietly around them. And as they reached the end of the street, where it opened onto a small square lined with bare trees and a low stone wall, Oliver slowed again, his steps coming to a gentle stop, and Rex mirrored the movement instantly, standing beside him with that same calm readiness. And for a moment, neither moved, neither spoke, the silence between them carrying a depth that did not require words. And Oliver looked out across the square, the faint outline of benches and pathways barely visible under the soft glow of distant lights, and he felt something settle within him, not a conclusion, not an answer, but a quiet acceptance of what had passed, and what it meant, not in grand terms, not in dramatic weight, but in the simple understanding that sometimes the difference between harm and safety is measured in a single decision, made without hesitation, guided by something deeper than thought. And he reached down once more, his hand resting firmly against Rex's back, grounding, steady. "You trust it," he said softly, not asking, not expecting a response, just speaking the truth as he saw it. And Rex remained still, his presence unwavering, his silence answering in the only way it needed to. And Oliver allowed a faint smile to form, brief but genuine, and then he straightened, his posture easing as he drew a quiet breath, the cool night air filling his lungs, and he turned slightly, his gaze returning to the path ahead, because there was always a path ahead, always another street, another moment, another quiet decision waiting to be made, and he gave a small nod, more to himself than to Rex, and then he stepped forward once more, their movement resuming in that same steady rhythm, carrying them deeper into the quiet folds of the city where the lights dimmed and the world softened, and where moments like the one they had passed through would not be seen, would not be spoken of, but would remain all the same, shaping the unseen edges of what comes next, in ways that only those who have stood at such moments can truly understand. The square lay quiet beneath the dim wash of streetlight, its empty benches and bare trees holding a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the city, for a brief moment, had chosen to step aside and leave this space untouched, and Oliver stood there with Rex beside him, neither in a hurry to move, neither needing to fill the silence that had settled between them, because some silences do not ask to be broken, they simply exist, carrying meaning in their absence of sound, and the cool air pressed gently against his face, clean after the rain, carrying faint traces of earth and stone, and somewhere beyond the square a distant clock struck the hour, its chime soft but clear, marking time without urgency, without insistence, and Oliver listened to it, not counting, not measuring, just acknowledging its presence, the way he had learned to acknowledge so many things that did not need interpretation, only awareness. And Rex shifted slightly, his paws adjusting against the pavement as he settled more comfortably beside him, his posture relaxed yet never careless, his ears still attuned to the quiet movements of the night, and Oliver glanced down at him, his expression thoughtful, as though something within him had finally reached a point of quiet understanding, and he lowered himself slowly onto the edge of the low stone wall, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his gaze drifting once more across the empty square, and for a moment, nothing moved, nothing changed, and yet everything felt complete, not because of what had happened, but because of what had not, because of the absence that now existed where something else might have been, and that absence carried its own weight, its own quiet significance, and Oliver found himself thinking not of the moment itself, but of the pattern it revealed, the quiet thread that ran through so many of the things he had witnessed over the years, moments where instinct stepped in before reason had time to catch up, where action preceded explanation, and where the outcome mattered far more than the understanding of how it had come to be. And he had once tried to place such moments into clear categories, to give them names, to make them manageable. But now, sitting here in the calm aftermath of one such moment, he realized that they did not need to be defined. They only needed to be recognized for what they were, small acts of alignment between awareness and response, carried out without hesitation, without doubt, and he exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a quiet release that seemed to carry away the last remnants of tension he had not even known he was holding, and Rex lifted his head slightly at the sound, his eyes meeting Oliver's for a brief second, and in that glance there was no question, no expectation, only presence, steady and assured, and Oliver allowed a faint smile to settle across his face, not broad, not fleeting, just enough to reflect the quiet ease that had replaced the earlier intensity, and he reached down, his hand resting firmly against Rex's back, feeling the warmth beneath the damp fur, the steady rhythm of breath that remained unchanged regardless of circumstance. And he spoke softly, not as a command, not as praise, but as something closer to a simple truth. You do not need to see it to know. And Rex remained still, his silence answering in the only way it needed to, and Oliver nodded slightly, as if acknowledging that answer, and for a while longer they stayed there, the square holding its quiet, the city continuing beyond its edges, and the night deepening in a way that softened everything. It touched, and eventually, Oliver rose again, his movements unhurried, his posture easy, and Rex stood with him at once, aligning without thought, ready to move whenever Oliver did. And together they stepped away from the square, their path leading into a narrower street where the lights grew dimmer and the world felt smaller, more contained. And as they walked, Oliver did not look back, not because there was nothing to see, but because there was nothing left to resolve. The moment had already found its place, settled into the quiet fabric of memory without demanding to be revisited, and ahead of them, the street stretched on, lined with modest homes and quiet doorways, each one holding its own unseen stories, its own small moments of stillness and change, and Oliver moved through it with the same steady rhythm, his steps neither quick nor slow, simply certain, and Rex remained at his side, his presence unchanged, his awareness constant, and as they continued, the city seemed to close gently around them once more, the sounds softening, the lights dimming, the world returning to its usual balance. And yet beneath it all, there remained that quiet understanding, that subtle shift that does not announce itself but stays, shaping the way things are seen and felt in the moments that follow, and Oliver carried that with him, not as a burden, not as a lesson to be repeated, but as something simpler, something quieter, a recognition that not all acts of protection are loud, not all moments of significance are visible, and that sometimes the most important thing that happens is the thing that never has the chance to happen at all. And as they walked on into the deeper quiet of the night, their footsteps fading into the soft rhythm of the street, there was no need to mark the end of anything. Because some stories do not end in a single moment. They continue, quietly, in the way we move forward, carrying with us the things we have learned without ever needing to say them aloud. The street grew quieter still as they moved deeper into it, the kind of quiet that does not feel empty but complete, where every small sound finds its place and nothing needs to be louder than it is, and Oliver walked with an ease that had returned fully now, his steps steady, his breathing even, the weight of the evening no longer pressing but settling into something softer, something that would remain without needing to be revisited. And Rex moved beside him in that same quiet rhythm, his presence unchanged, his awareness still there, but no longer sharp, simply present like a steady flame that does not flicker unless the wind demands it. And the houses along the street stood in quiet rows, their windows dimmed, curtains drawn, the soft glow of lamps casting gentle shapes against the glass. And somewhere inside those homes, lives unfolded in their own quiet ways, unaware of how close something had come to crossing into them, unaware of how a single moment, intercepted before it, could fully form, had shifted the course of an evening without leaving a mark. And Oliver slowed slightly as they approached his own door, the familiar outline of it appearing under the low porch light, and he paused there for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of habit, a quiet pause that marked the end of movement and the beginning of rest. And Rex stopped with him, his posture relaxed, his head lifting just enough to take in the stillness of the space. And Oliver reached into his pocket, the soft sound of keys brushing against metal carrying faintly in the quiet air. And before he unlocked the door, he glanced down at Rex once more, his expression thoughtful, not searching for answers, but acknowledging something that had already settled into place. And he let out a slow breath. "You do not ask why," he said softly. And Rex remained still, his silence answering in the same steady way it always had. And Oliver gave a small nod, as if that was enough, as if it always had been. And he opened the door, the hinge moving with a soft, familiar sound, and a warm light spilled out into the night, gentle and inviting. And Rex stepped inside without hesitation, his paws quiet against the wooden floor, his presence immediately filling the space with that same calm assurance he carried outside. And Oliver followed, closing the door behind him with a soft click. And for a moment, the world beyond it faded completely, leaving only the quiet interior, the faint hum of the house settling into its own rhythm. And Oliver leaned back against the door for just a second, his eyes closing briefly, not in exhaustion, but in a kind of quiet reflection that did not need to linger. And then he pushed himself away, moving further into the room, his hand reaching down to rest once more on Rex's back, grounding, familiar. And Rex moved with him, not leading, not following, simply there, as he always had been. And Oliver paused near the window, drawing back the curtain slightly to look out onto the street, where the lamplight still cast its soft glow, where the pavement lay quiet and undisturbed. And for a brief moment, he allowed himself to see it again, not the event, not the tension, but the stillness that had followed, the quiet resolution that had settled in its place. And then he let the curtain fall back into place, because the moment did not need to be held, it had already done what it was meant to do, and he turned away, the room now fully his. The night continuing outside without interruption, and Rex settled onto the floor nearby, his body relaxing completely for the first time since they had left the street. His breathing slow and even, and Oliver watched him for a moment. The simple presence of the dog carrying more weight than any explanation could, and he spoke quietly, not expecting an answer, not needing one. Some things do not need to be seen to be real, and Rex remained still, his silence once again the only response required, and Oliver allowed a faint smile to form, brief but genuine, before turning off the light, the room falling into a soft darkness that matched the calm outside. And as he moved further into the quiet of his home, there was nothing left to resolve, nothing left to question, only the quiet understanding that had settled into place, that sometimes the smallest act of awareness, the simplest movement made without hesitation, can hold back something that would otherwise change everything, and that such moments do not ask to be remembered. They simply become part of the unseen structure that keeps the world as it is, steady, balanced, and quietly protected. And in that stillness, as the night deepened and the city continued its endless rhythm beyond the walls, there remained a single, gentle truth, not spoken, not written, but felt in the quiet space between thought and breath, that sometimes what saves us is not what we notice, but what notices for us.